Hello there, and welcome to my third book recording. We'll kick straight into it. Chapter 3, Fired. It was early morning, the city streets were still dark, the towering buildings blocking the sunrise to the east. The only sign of the morning was a hint of warmth in the air. A soft breeze, carrying the sun's early rays, blew through the labyrinth of walkways and roads, bending and twisting around buildings, hitting daybreak joggers with a burst of fresh air. On the corner of Queen and Sterling Street, there were no daybreak joggers, no quiet breeze, nor the warmth of a new day. The air was still and stale. The darkness seemed deeper, and an eerie silence was upon the place. Two men stood in the pitch black at the bottom of a flight of stairs leading up into a tall apartment block. The light at the end of their cigarettes pierced the darkness. The larger of the men looked at his wristwatch and threw his fag to the ground, stomping it out with a heavy thud of his boot. 7 floors up, a light flickered out through a broken window. The shorter of the two men looked up at it, grunting, and then flicked his half-smoked cigarette onto the side of the walkway, where it swiftly rolled into a flood drain and went out with a silent hiss. Meanwhile, upon the 7th floor, Codell rolled over in bed, rubbing his eyes. It was 5:30 according to the clock sitting on his bedside table, much too early to be getting up. Candles flickered weakly around the room, not yet down to the stubs. Rose petals scattered the floor, only now with more volume, as the petals from the bed had been thrown onto the ground the night before. There was a pile of Hannah's and Codell's clothes, roughly heaped at the foot of the bed, keeping Hannah's feet snug and warm, and on Codell's right lay Hannah, scrunched up in the fetal position with the sheets wrapped around her so tight you would think she was in a straitjacket. She always gets cold at night, thought Codell, as he rolled over and balanced himself up on his elbow. He gazed down at her sleeping. Her red hair lay strewn over her pillow, knotting up in places as she tossed and turned in her sleep. A couple of longer hairs tickled Codell's nose as he reached down to pick out a couple of stray rose petals, which had become entangled. He smiled and began to trace a petal on her exposed upper back, sending a shiver down her spine. Reactively, she pulled the sheets higher and tighter. Still smiling, he kissed the back of her head and dragged himself out of bed. He fumbled his way through the candlelit room, attempting to make it to the bathroom as quietly as possible, so as not to wake Hannah. He cursed quietly to himself as he kicked his toe on the leg of the bed. Eventually he made it to the bathroom, where he closed the door before flicking on the light switch to his left. He let out an uncomfortable groan as he shielded his eyes from the light, hobbling to the sink. Turning on the cold water, he splashed his face, cleaning the sleep dust from his eyes. Ugh. He groaned again as he looked into the chipped mirror above the sink. You look terrible. His eyes were baggy, still wearing the effects of a late night, and he was as pale as a ghost. But that was usually the case until he got into the hot shower. He began to flex his muscles in various poses. His arms still hurt from yesterday, but he'd have to work through the pain. Conrad had a big session planned for him this morning. Intuitively, Codell's ears pricked up at an odd rumbling coming from the bedroom. Perhaps Hannah was climbing out of bed, but no. Her scream pierced the morning silence, sending Codell's heart into overdrive. Instantly, he threw open the bathroom door. There was a loud slam as it thudded into the wall. Codell! Hannah screamed again. Her legs and arms flew in all directions as two men attempted to subdue her. The shorter, stockier of the two received one of her violently swinging legs to the groin. The man let out a grunt of pain as he put his hands on his knees and swayed on the spot. "What are you doing, you stupid oaf?" yelled the other man, trying to bind Hannah's wrists. "Shut up!" wheezed the hurt man through a deep breath. While Hannah screamed and fought and the two men argued, Codell saw his chance. He sprinted across the room and leapt over the bed, a mad fury in his eyes as he dived towards the man wrestling with Hannah. The two of them hit the floor hard. Codell's wrist crunched under the weight of his target. "Oi!" spoke a squeaky voice from behind Codell. Codell swung a wild left hook into the side of the other man's face as he stood and turned around towards the sound of the voice. The man who had received the low blow had regained himself and now stood facing him. He had a fistful of Hannah's hair in his left hand and the other was twisting her arm forcibly behind her back. Codell could see the vein in her neck pulsating quickly. He could see the pain in her eyes as she tried to go limp in an attempt to release the pressure on her shoulder. Codell felt helpless. Hannah was meters from him, suffering, and he could do nothing. His anger was becoming uncontrollable as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Let her go!" he shouted, clenching his fists so tight his knuckles turned white. Let me think about that. The man looked at the ceiling in apparent thought. He smiled at Codell, then released his grip on Hannah's tangled hair. Hannah struggled to her feet and started to hobble over to Codell. Codell saw it out of the corner of his eye. The man who had just released her stepped forward and raised his heavy boot, kicking Hannah in the arch of her back as he yelled, "Not!" Hannah's green eyes screamed pain, but no sound escaped her. Her head smacked the leg of the bed with a thud, and there she lay, silent, motionless. "Idiot, Dink! You're a bloody idiot!" yelled the man who Codell had moments before flattened. Codell ignored him and ran to Hannah's side quickly, examining her vitals. "She's breathing." He let out a sigh of relief. He lifted her carefully in his arms and placed her gently on the bed. Already he could feel a lump rising on her head. Her legs were bright red and covered in superficial cuts from where they had connected with foreign objects as she had fought. Her hair was knotted and puffy, like it hadn't been washed in weeks, and there was a cut in her chin, bleeding slowly onto the white sheet. "Learn to be more careful, Dink. You know our instructions," said the other man, giving him a sharp clip around the ears. Codell was ignoring both of them as he ran to the kitchen for the first aid kit. The thought of Hannah being being permanently damaged frightened him more than the two intruders squabbling in his home. He ran back into the bedroom, head down, as he fiddled with the first aid kit in hand, trying to open it quickly. "You don't need that," he heard one of the men say. He looked up to see it was the man referred to as Dink speaking to him. The other man had made his way to the bed where Hannah lay and now stood firmly between the two. Cordell was barely out of arm's reach of the man. At first he thought of attacking again, but common sense prevailed. If Hannah was hurt again in the tussle, he would never forgive himself. In the end, he decided to wait and see what played out. "Have you heard of us?" asked Dink. With his sleeve, he wiped a little drool from the corner of his mouth. "We're the twins." Cordell looked curiously from Dink to the other man. He had heard of the twins, of course. They were Wayne Powers' notorious Iron Fist. If things couldn't be accomplished the way Powers wanted, he had the twins to see to it everything fell into place. Cordell had never actually met them, but had heard whispers of their misdeeds, and now he stood there staring at them, both of whom looked nothing like he had imagined. Each wore a leather jacket with the letters PD patched on the upper arm. They had worn jeans along with heavy work boots which thudded loudly as they stepped. Their faces seemed squished, like someone had stomped on them repeatedly, while each of their mouths slanted down to the left, where saliva streamed down the corner and onto their chin, causing them to constantly wipe it away. Both had shaved heads, pale as the moon. Contrasting against the pale white of their skin was their dark eyes, which were darkened more so by the shadow held by their thick black brow. Dink, he noticed, had a scar running along his left jawbone, from just below his ear to the centre of his chin. He hunched his large upper body as he stood with his head tilted to the right, staring at Cordell. He looked like an odd sort of intimidator as he stood with his feet pointing inwards like a child did when they were nervous. His brother, however, stood tall and menacing. It looked like he had learnt to control his salivation as he really had to wipe his mouth, compared to Dink, whose left sleeve was saturated. "I know who you are," Cordell said, staring at the other brother. "Please let me patch up Hannah." "Hannah will be fine," the brother replied. "It's you should be worried about." "What's your name?" Cordell asked. "Philip, and this is Dink." He gestured towards his brother. "Yeah, and we're here for you." Dink screamed manically across the room, spitting saliva everywhere. Philip turned to his brother and shook his head. "Shut up, you idiot." Dink nodded his head goofily and grinned at Philip, then turned back to face Cordell, his smile turning to a scowl. "We're here to pass on a message along with collecting Mr. Powers' belongings." "I got nothing here of his," said Cordell, scanning his brain to think what he might have taken. Hannah stirred on the bed and didn't wait. Cordell looked at her and clicked. "Hannah is not the property of Powers," he yelled, sickened. Dink started to chuckle, but Philip ignored him and said calmly, "We're taking her now. You are to turn up at work this morning. Business as usual." Dink continued laughing, slapping his knees as he looked at Cordell. Cordell gave him a burning stare before he replied to Philip, "This is not business as usual. What does Powers want with her?" Philip merely stared back at him. Cordell's mind was racing. Should he attempt to fight now or wait to confront Powers at the office? Surely if he let her go with the twins, her father would see to her wound. She was still his family. His thoughts were interrupted by the hysterical Dink, who was now on his back trying to breathe through his laughter. Philip gave his brother a sharp boot to the ribs. "What are you laughing at?" Dink's breathing steadied as he got his laughter under control. "He's naked, brother." He pointed at Cordell. Cordell looked down and realised he was stark naked. Philip smiled at his brother lying on the floor. "Yes, Dink, I can see that, but it's rude to laugh and point." Dink burst into another fit of laughter as Philip helped him to his feet. Cordell felt little shame at the heckling. His brain was clicking over and over, weighing up his options. "Cordell, you know the correct decision here," Philip began. "You have to let us take her. She'll get the best care available. Her father will see to that. You won't ever see her again, but at least you'll have more time for work and yourself. Mr. Powers is willing to let this unfortunate situation slide. Usually you'd be dead by now, but you've worked hard over the years. Mr. Powers appreciates this, and that is why he's willing to let things go. Think very hard about what is on offer." "On offer?" a frustrated Cordell replied. "The only thing that is on offer is for me to give her up and go back to my day job." Philip nodded his head. "Mr. Powers does insist you remain alive. He'll be in the office this morning and is more than happy to speak with you, should you wish. I'm sure he can have substantial remuneration benefits arranged." "Personally, I think you should be dead," said Dink, who had recovered from his fit of hysteria. "I told Mr. Powers, think what he's done to your daughter, an innocent young woman she was before you." Dink's eyes glazed over and he stared at the battered body of Hannah laying motionless on the bed. "But now this man has destroyed her and turned her into a common tramp. I told Mr. Powers you deserve death, a long painful death, but he disagreed. He has value, he says. Still, I hope to get pleasure of twisting your neck." Cordell started towards Dink. "Stop!" He stopped. Philip had lifted Hannah's head by her hair and was shaking his finger at him. "What's it gonna be?" Cordell couldn't control himself. He lunged at Philip, his arms outstretched, ready to tackle him to the ground, but before he had made it to the foot of the bed, something smashed into the side of his face, sending him straight to the floor with a thud. He lay on his back, staring up at the twins' squished faces looking down on him. The room seemed to spin. He smacked his hands down flat on the floor, as if to keep himself still, but the room and faces kept spinning. Dink and Philip's faces still span in Cordell's head when he woke, lying next to the smashed remnants of his bedside lamp, which Dink had hurled into his face as he had lunged at Philip. Getting up gingerly, he quickly surveyed the room. Hannah and the twins were gone. Events from earlier replayed through his head as the dull thud where the lamp had hit him slowly faded. The twins, Hannah, Mr. Powers, it had all happened so suddenly he could barely process it. He sat on the edge of the bed where Hannah had lain only hours before. He could still smell her scent on the air. Everything was a mess. How could they have been so stupid as to think they could get away with it? So naive to underestimate what powers would actually do. He ran his hands through his hair. He hoped Hannah would be alright, and that her father would care enough to look after her. After this morning it was clear he wouldn't see Hannah for a long time. If ever. But how could Powers possibly think Codell would just move on? These thoughts drifted through his mind like a slideshow, but the one thought he always came back to was Hannah, and how the twins had harmed her so much. He didn't even know if she was alright. The image of her lying motionless on the bed, barely breathing, kept creeping back. His anger grew steadily while he sat musing on the bed. He wanted to punish the twins and have revenge on Powers for everything he had done. Codell wanted Hannah safe. If he wanted to be happy and free, there was only one option. He stood up and stormed across the room to his wardrobe. There seemed to be a voice in the back of his head whispering to him, telling him they all deserved death and pain. To punish them. His conscience wrestled with these wild thoughts. You can't kill them. It's not right. That's not how to deal with this. Go to the authorities and think sensibly. Codell barely heard this reasoning as the image thudding into his head was of Hannah. His imagination ran wild and the things that could be happening to her right now at the hands of the twins. These thoughts took hold of him and the crazy whispers became reasonable words and finally became written law in his mind. Bursting with rage, he yelled into the mirrored door of his wardrobe. He stood there, naked, staring sternly into his own eyes. You hesitated, you fool. Don't let it happen again. He raised his clenched fist to his chest. I will bring them pain. Codell rushed around his apartment, carefully avoiding the shards of lamp as he gathered his clothing from the end of the bed and threw on yesterday's suit. He didn't bother with the tie. This was an open collar task. Within 5 minutes he was once again staring into the mirror. If it was any other day he'd simply be dressing for work, dreading the hours ahead, but not today. In this moment he had a purpose, for once in his life. Rolling up the sleeves of his crinkled white shirt, a tiny smirk crossed his face. Hannah would have insisted on the tie. A suit wasn't a suit without a tie, she always said. As quickly as the smirk appeared, it faded. His face resorted back to a look of steel. A deadly calm had come over him. He was in complete control of his rage. It was as though the whole world had slowed down and he could see which path he had to take, the only path that would truly lead to complete freedom for Hannah. She did not deserve the chains her father wrapped around her. She didn't deserve a life of secrecy, however happy it may be. She deserved to be able to walk through the street without looking over her shoulder, to enjoy a nice dinner in the park with whomever she chose. But above all, she deserved a life of her own, away from the reign of Power Corp. His part in all of this was an afterthought. Hannah was the bigger picture. A sharp beeping sound came from under the bed. His alarm clock had fallen under during the struggle and was now trying to wake him for his 8:15 start. He reached down and pulled it out, unplugging it in the process. Codell didn't take the time to lock the front door as he sprinted down the building steps and emerged puffing at the bottom. The very tips of the sun's golden rays were creeping ever so slowly down the length of his building. The streets were empty apart from a single taxi parked across the road. The taxi was yellow, but the driver had seemed not to care much for its appearance, neglecting to clean the mud and dirt from it. He sprinted across the road and approached it, noticing it was parked with its two front wheels on the footpath with its rear hanging on the road. He wiped away the build-up of dust on the driver's window and peered in. The driver, it seemed, was stretched out in the back seat, apparently asleep. He had a beanie pulled down over his eyes. The tracky dacks he wore were stained, dirty, and had a big hole in the crotch where Codell could make out his colourful underwear. His shirt had been half taken off. It looked like the man had been almost there before giving up because it was tangled up around his neck. His left arm dangled down from the seat, resting in the midsection between the two front seats. Clasped in his hand was an empty bottle of vodka. Codell opened the unlocked door and jumped into the driver's seat. His car, he remembered, was nearly out of fuel and he didn't want to risk stalling on the way. The key to the taxi was hanging from the ignition in the off position. Codell turned it, revving the car just a little to counter the cool morning. With a bump, he reversed off the curb and headed for the freeway. Oi! The taxi driver had woken up and dropped his vodka bottle. He let the dregs spill onto the floor as he struggled into a seated position. What do you think you're doing in my car? The words stumbled out of his mouth like a drunk stumbles to his feet. Codell took a sharp left turn and the man in the back was thrown up against the right door. I'm borrowing it, he replied, manoeuvring the car through a small side street. Codell looked in the rear vision mirror at the driver in the back. He'd revealed a fresh bottle of vodka and was swinging it back like it was orange juice. Nice suit, the driver spat. Missing a tie though. Codell ignored him, but applied a little more accelerator down the freeway. Want a drink? The driver asked, leaning right up close to Codell. I'm alright, thanks. Codell almost dry-retched. The driver smelt like fresh chunder and urine. He breathed a sigh of relief when the man leant back into his seat and pulled his beanie back over his eyes. He was asleep by the time Codell pulled up outside Power Corp. However, he'd been thrown around the back seat and was now lying with his head resting awkwardly against the door. Codell swung open his door and stepped out into the unusually chilly morning. The sun was on his back, but there was no warmth, or if there was, it didn't penetrate through the thick aura of dread surrounding him. Thunder rumbled in the distant black clouds which were gathering in the skies ahead. They slowly crawled towards him, just peeking over the high roof of the Power Corp building. They bent to the will of the breeze like instruments playing Codell's last dance. He shook a shutter off his back and made his way through the large double glass doors of Power Corp. The reception was empty. Judy hadn't arrived yet. The clunking noise of an elevator kicking into gear from the corridor to his right startled him. He made his way cautiously down the corridor, expecting to have one of the twins fly at him, but they never came. The elevator doors slid open. It was empty. His heart was racing. He stepped into the empty elevator and began to ride it to the same floor he had been working on for most of his life. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself for what lay ahead. He needed to relax. His body wouldn't do him any favours if he was on edge. He needed to be in complete control. He took another deep breath and felt his heartbeat slow. He closed his eyes. As soon as the doors opened, he had to be prepared. The elevator came to a stop. A short ring and the doors opened. He stepped out and walked straight past his desk without a glance. He was fully concentrated on the man in the next room. A few people had arrived early for work, but with their heads buried hidden in their cubicles, they didn't notice Codell's demeanour. He approached Powers' door, the large office at the end of the floor. It swung open. Dink held it and nodded as Codell walked through. "Good morning, Codell," Powers said in his rusty voice. "I hope my men didn't frighten you earlier. I did request them to be gentle, you being one of my hardest workers." He sat with his fat gut hidden behind a large mahogany desk. He was spinning a revolver casually on his index finger. Philip stood to his right, grinning at him, but Codell only had eyes for Hannah, who was gagged. Her hands and feet were bound and she lay flat on Powers' desk, struggling to turn to face Codell. Dink shut the door behind him. Codell turned slightly so he had both Dink and Philip in view. They both grinned at him. Dink wiped the corner of his mouth. Hannah wriggled on the desk. She lifted her head and stared at Codell. Her emerald green eyes glistened beautifully under a steady stream of tears. She lay helpless, crying. She knew he would come for her, but she had prayed with all her might that he would not. There was no way either of them was going to survive. All she wanted was for Codell to run far away and never stop, for death would always chase him as long as her father lived. Codell's heart accelerated at the look of distress on Hannah's face. He reluctantly broke his gaze from her and stared firmly at Powers. If looks could kill, Mr. Powers would have been struck down then and there, under the ferocity of his stare. "Let Hannah go," said Codell. Powers smiled, his wide face stretched unnaturally. "I thought after this morning you'd have realised that won't happen. I was hoping you'd be reasonable." Powers chuckled. "How long have you known me, Codell? I don't do reasonable." "No, you don't," said Codell sorrowfully. Powers ceased twirling his revolver and placed it down on his desk. He stretched back on his chair, placed his hands behind his head, and lifted his feet onto the desk, kicking Hannah aside to make room. "I assume you've come to me now because you don't wish to return to work." Codell didn't answer as he surveyed the room around them. "It seems we have 3 options," Powers proceeded to explain. "First, you turn around now and return to your desk with a sizable pay increase, leaving Hannah with me, of course. Second, you profess your love for my daughter right now while I watch in amusement. Seemingly you cannot live without her, so you state. I take pity, so I kill you. Finally, you do something really foolish, for which I'm forced to kill you. Pick one." "Mr. Powers," said Codell through his clenched jaw, "I quit." It was now or never. He braced himself, forcing himself to keep a clear head and remember all Conrad had taught him. Powers looked at both Dink and Philip, giving each a slight nod. They both clenched their fists and began to slowly close in on Codell. "No, Codell, you're fired. Effective immediately." Dink broke into a run. The ground seemed to rumble underneath every step he took. Codell was expecting this approach from the man so eager to have his head. He turned quickly on his heel, dropping down low on the floor and swung his right leg around. He caught Dink's ankle mid-stride and followed through with his leg, flipping Dink onto his side mid-air. Dink's head crashed into the ground first and snapped back a little, fighting the momentum of his body trying to flip over. Codell was still low on the ground as Philip swung a heavy boot into his chest. Air was thrust out of his lungs, but he managed to roll to his side and get to his feet, at the same time avoiding a wild punch from Philip. Still short of breath, he rushed at Dink, who was just regaining his feet. He grabbed his neck in a chokehold. Dink gagged and tried to pull his arm away, but Codell was taller and had a firm grip. Philip stopped, unsure of what to do. He seemed to make a decision to approach, but Codell tutted him and pulled his arm tighter around Dink's neck. Dink was gasping now, trying to suck in some oxygen, but none could slip through his closed windpipe. Codell's heart sped up as he stood there staring into Philip's eyes. He enjoyed watching Philip watch his own brother die. He enjoyed the sound of Dink's silent screams. He leaned his face forward and stared into Dink's left eye. Codell smiled at the look of horror on his face. He took a deep breath of air and taunting Dink. Then he leaned back and used his left arm to grasp his own wrist. He pulled it higher and tighter until Dink's struggling body went limp in his arms, the last wisp of air extinguished from his lungs. He dropped Dink's lifeless body and closed his eyes, savouring the ecstasy of death. He had never felt like this before. The urge to take Philip's life was nearly uncontrollable. He wanted to feel another's soul leave their body. He opened his eyes and stared straight at Philip. Philip seemed to know what he was thinking because he made to turn back to Powers and get behind the safety of his gun. But Codell was too quick. He leapt over Dink's body and tackled Philip to the ground. Philip's face was crunched into the floor. Codell crawled onto Philip's back, who was bucking, attempting to throw him off, but Codell was too well balanced. He sunk his fingers into Philip's eye sockets and pulled his head back, exposing his throat. He gave him a sharp punch in the Adam's apple, partially winding him. He then placed his hands either side of his head and twisted with all his strength, snapping his neck. Codell's heart was beating a million beats a second. He could taste death in the air like freshly baked bread. He stepped over Philip's body and sank to his knees. He looked across at Powers and Hannah. He'd almost forgotten they were in the room. Hannah had stopped crying but was still struggling with her bonds. Powers stood up and walked across to him. Codell couldn't see the revolver concealed behind his back. "Can you feel the bloodlust?" Powers asked quietly. Codell looked at his hands. There was no blood or scars on them to prove that they killed, but he could see the proof as clear as Philip and Dink's blood was smeared all over them. "What did I just do?" he asked himself. Powers answered, You killed ruthlessly." Codell looked up at Powers, who stared down at him approvingly. He broke off. Powers had pulled out his revolver and had pointed it directly at Codell's forehead. "You did well, Codell. And now it's time to go." In that instant, Codell jumped to his feet. The bloodlust that had faded rushed back. He turned the gun away and swung his clenched fist towards Powers' unshaven jaw. His fist had barely grazed its target when Codell's chest exploded. He fell to his back onto the hard marble floor. Blood slowly seeped out his wounds. Powers stood still. Codell had expected him to be looking down in delight, but he stood shocked, a look of crazed pain on his face. Blood was spurting out of him like a sprinkler. He fell to his knees, his blood splashed all over Codell's immobile body. With one last failed attempt at a breath, Powers fell like a tower right on top of Codell, who groaned on impact. Codell tried to move, but his wounds were too severe. He couldn't gather the strength to push the heavy weight off. He was numb. He used his hands in an attempt to stem the bleeding, but the blood rushed out of him. "Codell!" Hannah's sweet voice brought him back from the brink of unconsciousness. He opened his eyes slightly and saw his beautiful Hannah. Her hands were free, but her feet were still bound. Tears streamed down her face, almost as fast as blood left his body. I lost my balance," she stammered through her sobs. "There wasn't time to unbind my legs. I just got the gun, but you jumped up." Codell could see in his mind's eye what had happened. Hannah had freed her hands in time to grab the gun Powers kept in his bottom drawer, and he could see himself jump up to attack Powers just as she had begun to empty the cartridge into her father. She had taken them both out in her desperate attempt to save the one she loved. Hannah pushed her father's body off Codell and tried to stem his bleeding. Codell looked up at Hannah. Already he felt his soul departing his body. "No," he made to push her hands away. "It's too late. Come and lay with me, please." Hannah sobbed, then stretched out, laying her head on his shoulder. Her beautiful eyes were barely visible behind her tears and puffed up cheeks. Her hands and clothes were covered in his blood. Codell wished he could wipe her eyes dry, but he could barely stay conscious. "Please stay with me," she whispered quietly into his ear. "I'm sorry," he said simply. He could already hear the faint melody of angels calling him over. "No, Codell, we're free! Free to be together for the rest of our lives," Hannah said, almost yelling at him, as if he would listen if she raised her voice. Codell smiled his last smile. "No, beautiful." He kissed her forehead. "You're free now. You've been my angel all this time. Now it's time for me to be yours. I love you." Codell didn't feel Hannah kiss his lips as he shut his eyes. He was too far gone. He fell deeper into death's arms. There were no more angels calling him, and no hand to lead him through the darkness that lay ahead. Yeah, I hope you enjoy that one. Look forward to chapter 4, and what lays beyond death.